The following is a presentation from TNTP. If your school or district is interested in direct support related to the content of this session, or if you have any questions, please contact us by emailing maya.baker@tntp.org or christopher.henderson@tntp.org. You can find us online at www.tntp.org or on Facebook, Twitter, or LinkedIn. Now, please enjoy the session.
Hi everyone, welcome to our fourth session. This session is around analyzing and responding to data in foundational literacy. I'm Kenna McWhorter and I'm going to be walking us all through this session. I'm so excited to be presenting this session because the importance of responding to data correctly and being able to analyze it effectively and then respond is so important in terms of ensuring that our students move quickly in their foundational literacy skills to really set them up for success in their future learning endeavors. All right, so for your do now, I want you to look at this graph. Go ahead and think about the questions that are on this graph or are on this slide. What does this graph demonstrate about reading achievement gaps? What causes them? What can close them or prevent them from starting? Go ahead and take a few minutes to think about these questions and jot down your responses. If you're presenting to a group, this is a great time to pause to give those 2 minutes. All right, so from looking at this slide, we can see that the Matthew effects are not only about the progressive decline of slow starters, but also about the widening gap between slow starters and fast starters in reading. Basically, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer is the saying I think of when I look at this graph. Some children start out behind, but they just don't start out behind. They fall further and further behind their peers. The work in early grades is important to give all children opportunity so that we must teach well, assess how students are doing, and respond to that data so we don't see the effects caused by the Matthew effects. Those are my takeaways from this slide. Hopefully you were able to share out your thoughts and responses about what you think about this slide. Keep those reflections in mind as we move forward through the next few slides. All right, so the team that you've been hearing from a lot includes myself, Kenna McWhorter. We also have Caitlin McDermott and Nisha Thakur, who have all been leading different presentations. We have really enjoyed being able to meet with you all and present with you. So hopefully you find this session just as important as you found 1 through 3. All right, so our goal today, how we'll be really spending our time is thinking through these objectives. So our overall goal is that participants will learn how to internalize data to pivot instruction and target lessons based on data. You will be able to walk away understanding essential elements of a foundational skills diagnostic assessment, interpret the assessment data to determine what individual students know and what gaps students have, and finally use the data to plan instruction, whole group, small group, and individual targeted instruction. Right, so we're going to start with reviewing Science of Reading Learning. These are all slides that we've kind of grounded all of our previous sessions in, and they will help us ground our work today. So to start our learning today, we're going to start by grounding ourselves in some familiar graphics to not only review what we have learned throughout the series, but also how important it is to fill in gaps based off of data to ensure students get the best instruction tailored to their needs. In Our first 3 sessions, we've seen this slide, the simple view of reading. In the very first session, we really talked about phonics and phonemic awareness, which allows scholars to really harness that decoding skill. Then we worked on text complexity and vocabulary, which will help with the language comprehension. We know that both of those things must be there, or reading comprehension doesn't matter. If that decoding or if that language comprehension is a 0, no matter how high something else is, ultimately our reading comprehension will still be at a 0. With that in mind, we must ensure that students are rapidly learning these decoding skills, or all that other work won't matter. Today, we'll be diving in how we test and monitor these foundational skills to really close up the gaps so we don't have that effect that we saw in our do now. Again, this is a slide that you all have seen a few times. This is our reading rope. When we think about the previous slide, we know that if there's no decoding, there is no reading comprehension. So we know by just looking up here that the decoding would be that word recognition. So being able to break down and put together sounds, letters, and words to be able to start that increasingly automatic reading that we need to see from scholars. So I want you to think, how do we ensure that students are learning these skills on the correct timeline and having the right instruction to minimize gaps? I'm going to repeat that question one more time. How do we ensure that students are learning these skills on the correct timeline and having the right instruction to minimize gaps? Go ahead and pause the video here and reflect on that question, or turn and talk to someone close by you or on video chat about that question. So thinking about how do we ensure that students are learning these skills on the correct timeline, the first thing that I think of is we have to ensure that we have a strong scope and sequence. And from that scope and sequence, we're really able to see benchmark assessments of if scholars are overall mastering the skills that are taught. Within that, we also need to see from assessments, diagnostic assessments of where scholars are in the beginning, middle, and end year. So we have a pulse on where they are, and then we're able to check if they're growing and how rapidly they're going through those benchmarks. Reading researchers have determined that with few exceptions, students should be capable readers as long as they receive appropriate and strong instruction. We can notice that if students need extra support early because they may have a few characteristics of dyslexia, we can support them quicker instead of waiting a few years and letting that gap grow. Some reflections from this slide make me think that about 35 to 40% of kids will learn to read with relatively little instruction and few repetitions of phonics skills. Another 40 to 50% of kids need systematic, explicit, sequential instruction in how to code the English works to help them build their neural pathways between the visual auditory areas of their brain. About 10 to 15 students require systematic sequential instructions in phonics and phonemic awareness, but with lots and lots of repetitions. These students, that would include those we would consider dyslexic, but it's really important to note that dyslexic doesn't mean that these students can't learn to read, but that they need more intensive repetition. The bottom line, this is not a question of a student's ability. It is a question of instruction. With systematic, explicit instruction in phonemic awareness, phonics, and word recognition, with that approach, that will best support all the learners for all students. When we see gaps in learning, we need to be able to intervene correctly and effectively. All right, so with kicking the session off, we wanted to make sure we were grounded in the research behind the science of reading. How does this information that we just went over highlight the importance of collecting strong data in foundational literacy? Go ahead and again, pause your camera right here and go ahead and reflect. You can also do a chat in the chat box, or you can do a breakout room to discuss this question. Right, so moving on, now we're going to be discussing essential parts of foundational skills assessments to ensure that the correct data is being collected. I want you to picture the perfect foundational literacy assessment. What all would this assessment consist of? How often is the assessment tested? What skills would be tested? How will scholars perform this task? When I'm saying assessment, right now I'm thinking more of a holistic diagnostic assessment that you would take probably 3 times a year to get a good pulse on where scholars are. So here are some grade level skills students need to learn. I want you to go ahead and jot down your dream screener. This will help you compare with other screeners. Keep in mind all of what we have learned over the past sessions while you're creating this. Go ahead and take about 5 minutes to create your own assessment. Again, this will help you so whenever you write, like it needs to be scholar oriented where they're the ones doing the work and it's not paper and pencil, and you write those things down. When you go into comparing other assessments, this will give you that idea of exactly what you're looking for. Right, so go ahead and take 5 minutes and complete that task. All right, great. Now that you have done that task, we'll go ahead and continue with analyzing and diving into screeners. Often a curriculum might come with an assessment. The assessment might be really strong or weak. It also may be only an assessment that will test scholars after a skill has been taught, but it doesn't give you the data of how they're doing before that unit or at the beginning of the year, middle of the year, end of year. You might be asked to give certain assessments to your students that you want to use that data to inform your phonics instruction. It's important that you have a really strong eye at selecting and advocating for the right screener. This is also really important when you're working with students who might not be in that K2 grade band, but still do not have a strong foundation in these skills. As a coach, you want to ensure that your teachers are not only using the right assessments, but they know why that's the right assessment. With the PowerPoint, there is a link with some assessments. Go ahead and click on that link and look up those assessments that are in that Google Drive. Each time you're looking at an assessment, I want you to think about the strengths and some possible weaknesses in the screener. When we come back together, we will discuss some of the screeners, what we felt like were really strong, and then where we may have to fill in some gaps with that assessment. All right, so here, go ahead and pause your camera or pause the video and take about 7 minutes to look into these assessments. When you're done with that, if you're with a group, go ahead and start discussing what was strong and then maybe some areas of opportunities that you would have to fill in if you use that assessment. All right, So now that you've been able to dive into those assessments, hopefully you were able to get some really strong reflections and discussions based off of that assessment, or based off of those assessments. I think something to note is that these are diagnostic tools that are universal screeners, so they do not go specifically with one assessment. Something that I really like about the Quick Phonics screener is that the Quick Phonics screener is one, it's what the title is, it's quick, right? You can quickly use it, and definitely for older scholars that are struggling and you don't know where to begin because you may not have that historical data, they may be new to your school, so you don't know exactly where to start filling in gaps, that will tell you exactly that, oh, this 5th grader is really struggling when it comes to difficult vowel teams in 2nd grade. So let's go back there, start there, and then build up based off of that data. Something that's a little harder with that screener is it doesn't give you it gives you small parts that are being tested, not 15 different things. So if you're trying to look at CVC and you're trying to get a pattern of, are they able to memorize the CVC words? You're not getting enough data based off of that. However, it's still a strong screener for its purpose. Another screener that really stood out to me is Core Phonics because it tests in each area. It has multiple at-bats for kids. So when you're looking at like CVC words, and let's say a scholar gets 10 CVC words and they miss 5, you probably can go back and then you can quickly see, oh, they're missing all the nonsense CVC words. So what they're able to do right now is read the CVC words that they know, but they're not actually blending the letters. So I need to go back and practice those nonsense words and really hit blending with those scholars. So that assessment really gives you so much data that you can really assess and be able to diagnose scholar trends, because there's so many examples and questions for scholars to complete. One challenge with that is that there's no phonemic awareness. So you would have to pair that with one of the phonemic awareness only assessments. These are just a few of the reflections I had by looking at the screener, so I wanted to share my reflections, but hopefully you were already able to share all of your thoughts with the team you're working with, or reflect silently if you're watching this by yourself. Before we move on, I want you to think about these reflection questions. One is, what are 3 things that you will always look for when choosing a foundational skills assessment? And then 2, how will your curriculum impact what screener you choose? Go ahead and do a reflection, a written reflection, so jot down your answers. Once you've jotted down your answers, go ahead and share with the people that you're working with. And if you're not working with anyone, you can just hit unpause. So go ahead and pause here to answer these reflection questions, then discuss, then go ahead and go back to unpause. All right, so now that we've been able to discuss some essential parts of a foundational skills assessment, we're going to dive into interpreting the data from a foundational skills assessment. We're really going to dive into determining what individual students know and what gaps they have. All right, so here you have middle of the year kindergarten assessment data from the Core Phonics screener. Something that's really important before you're diving into the data assessment is you norm around and you look at what are the expectations for this point of the year. Are scholars doing okay? Are they struggling? And then you think about your standards that you're teaching in your state, so in Nebraska, and you think about your curriculum. So you want to make sure that while you're looking at this data, your eyes automatically going to be drawn to certain things. But then you have to take a step back and think about what are the standards that that students have to complete by the end of the year. Then you have to think, what's my scope and sequence, and have I taught this? Because if you haven't taught it and no scholars are mastering, you don't need to do a data analysis of that. You just simply need to look at your scope and sequence to see when that comes up. And if it comes up maybe in like April or May and you know it's going to be a struggle, you may think about how you could move that up. All right, so when you're looking at this data, you quickly notice some deficits of some scholars, but you also notice a lot of strengths of scholars. When looking at data, you need to consider outliers of scholars who are not with their peers, but also where all scholars need to be. So meaning that if you have 4 scholars that are really low, your eye may go to, I need to do small groups for these 4 scholars. But then if you look at your whole group and you have over 70% who are not proficient in the skills you've already taught, a small group's not going to be enough. You're going to need to go back and reteach. So just because you may have some outliers, if you're not having a pulse of where scholars need to be on that assessment, those outliers may not actually be outliers and it may be a bigger group. You also then, once you look for those individual scholars, you want to start to group students who have the same area of growth. Then you look for that entire push for the class. Remember to look at where scholars should be performing at this point of the year while you're doing all those things. Also, you typically would already know what curriculum has been taught and what's coming up next because you would have a scope and sequence in front of you. So anytime you're looking at data, you want to make sure not only that you have the curriculum with you, but you have the assessment as well, but you also have the standards so you can make sure that the assessment, if it's a universal screener, it may not have been developed in Nebraska. So you want to make sure whatever screener you're utilizing goes with the standards, but also those standards are being taught in your curriculum. And if they're not, you have already put in plans when you're teaching certain things that may not be in your curriculum. All right, so in this case, we don't have that context of the curriculum and the scope and sequence in front of us. So I'm going to give you the information that you need to know about this teacher to help you know what is happening in the classroom. The context is that this teacher has been implementing the curriculum exactly. The curriculum so far for all of the first semester, because again, this is middle of the year, kindergarten data, the teacher has been focusing on letter ID, letter sounds, and blending CVC words. The teacher has not looked at the Nebraska standards to implement any gaps. So now you're going to work with your peers for 10 minutes. Your group should be around 4 to 5 people. And again, if you're by yourself, you can do this independently just as effectively. You're going to look at this data, and I want you to be able to break down what are the scholars that are struggling, any groups, and then if there are groups, what is that growth area that they need? And then think about any class trends. All right, so go ahead, pause this for 10 minutes, and then you'll come back and join me. All right, so hopefully you had some great discussions or some great reflections while you were working through this. There's a lot of different things that you can notice of how scholars were really strong in certain areas and may have struggled in some areas. Something that overall was interesting is that some scholars with their sounds were really strong, but then when it came to vowel sounds, they may have struggled more. So the first class trend I would think about is making sure that scholars really know those short vowel sounds because that can impact that CVC. Another thing that you may have instantly went to is that long vowel sounds and being able to identify those 5 long vowel sounds is a huge gap. However, if you think about the context that I gave around this teacher, she hasn't taught anything with long vowels. So if I was working with this teacher, if I was this teacher, I would go and see when my curriculum picks this up. And then I would notice, okay, what scholars have mastered everything already that are really ready for this next step. So thinking about Johnny, he needs a little work in CVC because the total in CVC is 15. However, clearly knows his letter identification, his sounds. The next step for him would be long vowels. So I would go ahead and plan this scholar is ready for that push. So maybe in their decodable, in their small groups during guided reading, I'm going to get a decodable that really has more long vowels. And that's what we're going to practice before the book. And that's what I'm going to be pushing and monitoring them is that long vowels. So you can also look at this data of what are my next steps for my scholars who are already performing at the right grade level. And again, here you usually would write down like my individuals that need individual support, my groups and who belong in that group and what the trend is, and then overall the class, what I'm going to focus on. So hopefully you walked away with that from your group. If you haven't and you're facilitating this with a group, I would go ahead and pause and just really discuss what are those actions or what's the data telling us that we need to focus on. So reflecting on this process, I want you to think about what was simple about looking at data, what was difficult, and then any new practices that you will start after going through this process. Your mind may go to, oh, it was difficult because I didn't have the data in my hand that I could like highlight and things like that. Try to think more about the cognitive load and the cognitive process that you went through, not the logistics, because the logistics are really easy to fix. It's more the thinking that was difficult that you want to be able to practice. So being able to state that specific thinking that was harder, or just the reflection, the discussion part. Okay, and then with that, you'll pause your camera and you'll have a debrief. You can do in the chat, or you can go ahead and have people just come off mute to talk about that. All right, so moving right along, we're now moving into utilizing data to implement strategic interventions and give feedback to students. All right, so some classroom reading instruction that supports struggling readers. You can see there's a few different things. So first, teach essential skills and strategies. Really diving into those essential skills and going over and over those strategies, but also making sure that the scholars know how transferable those strategies are. So when you're decoding words in phonics, you're talking about certain strategies of decoding, and then when you see scholars, I don't know, in math, and you see a math problem that they can decode, you're giving them those same strategies in that same language, and you're really reinforcing that this is how we attack a word. But you're also really focusing on the true part of the essential skills, and you're not getting caught up in, oh, my scholars need to learn X, so I'm going to teach them this in an unauthentic way, and I'm just going to go over like nouns and list all the nouns, versus teaching it in a very holistic way that is natural to what they're currently learning. Right. Another tip is that providing differentiated instruction based on assessment results and adapt instruction to meet students' needs. Another effective way for teaching reading for struggling readers is providing explicit and systematic instruction with lots of practice. And then that practice needs to vary between having a lot of support and feedback and then also without. Right? And then providing opportunities to apply skills and strategies and reading and writing meaningful text with teacher support. And again, this is kind of like of course thing, but it's also something that is easier thought than really done. Don't just cover the critical content, be sure students really learn it. So that means you're monitoring their student progress regularly and you're reteaching as necessary. And then you're also seeing those gaps and you're able to identify this scholar is struggling with X, so I'm going to have them do this practice when we go through it as a whole group. They're going to be leading it, so you can give them that feedback right away, right? So you're wanting to make sure everyone masters the critical content and that you're just not covering it. All right, so I want you to read what's on the screen. Why do these interventions have such a strong impact? When you think about the 3 interventions that are up here, you can see that studies that have demonstrated very large gains include these key features. Why are those 3 key features have such a high impact? If you're watching this video by yourself, reflect on that and write that down. If you're in a group setting, go ahead and discuss that either in pairs or breakout rooms. Take 3 minutes to do this. All right, great. So hopefully you had some great discussion. I think one of the biggest things is that aggressively fixing problems and being able to be trained at an advanced level will allow you to fix those problems aggressively. Another really strong intervention is that they've taught and reinforced phonics decoding skills. So with that, you're not just teaching a phonics skill in phonics, but then you're giving them the text in front of them that directly allows them to practice that skill that you've just been going over. And then you're constantly reinforcing how you attack that word with whatever system or language that you modeled that. You're using and reinforcing that same language, so they're always using that same skill in the same way. And then obviously, you're giving students ample opportunities to read connected text. So you're not just giving them a text out of context, but you're building on whatever you're currently working on in class. You're giving them texts that are connected to that to deepen their language or to deepen their understanding of that content. So to be able to successfully intervene and use those great interventions that we saw in the previous slide, we must monitor all students, and we need to assess the understanding and provide explicit feedback, including error correction frequently, so that we can course correct. So when thinking about assessments, there's a lot of different purposes of assessments. And those different purposes will really change how you utilize that data. So when looking at a foundational skills assessment, that's like core or DIBELS, or those assessments we looked at earlier in the presentation. Those are typically assessments that are diagnostic assessments. So you would do those 3 times a year. You often do it before any content is taught at the beginning of the year. And you see where the gaps are with your scholars right when they come into your classroom. You also can see their strengths. You would then, if also you're like a 2nd grade teacher, you'd be able to use the end of year foundational skills assessments from the 1st grade class and be able to see how significant their summer slope was, and if you just need to like reteach things real quickly because they mastered it at one point, or if they still are missing things that they probably should have mastered in first grade. All right, and then the progress monitoring is often an assessment that would be in your curriculum. So it may be every 3 weeks. I know the curriculum that I use, we assess scholars every 3 weeks. And that is what is currently being taught in the phonics classroom. So we can see exactly if we just taught something for 3 weeks, are scholars mastering it or not? And that gives us a really good pulse on how instruction is going and how scholars are retaining instruction. And then finally, the in the moment assessments give us an insight into what students know right away, and we can give them that feedback on the spot and that correction on the spot to hopefully close those gaps. So then by the time we get to the progress monitoring assessment, they're mastering it. And then when we get to that middle and end of year foundational skills assessment, we're able to see those big growth that is more universal skills and not tied to a curriculum. So here's a flow chart of how preparing to teach, delivering instruction, and assessments work together. So you'll see the first thing you're doing is you're preparing for your instruction. Something that's often easy to skip in phonics instruction is not doing the intellectual prep for your lesson. It's really important to go through your lesson in entirety before you teach it, to think about the data that you already have. And then while you're going through that prep, you're thinking about what are misconceptions and errors that I know will come up. That can be because this is a tricky skill, or because you have the data that tells you that scholars really always struggle with long vowel, like the long I vowel sound. So you know when you see a passage with a lot of long I vowels, that there's going to be a lot of errors. And so you can go ahead and anticipate that. And then you're going to make sure you're providing, while you're teaching, you're providing that input to your students. While you're teaching, you're going to be thinking about what is happening and why. The two questions you're asking yourself is, what trends do I see? Why is this individual student responding this way? So once you've thought about that and you've observed and you've investigated, you then go into act. If you've prepared really strongly for this lesson, you probably already have an idea of how you're going to respond to observations and data, because you know your students so well and you're kind of expecting them to meet these errors because you've thought about it so deeply and you've looked at your data, so it's not anything that's shocking to you. So the 4 ways that you can act is you give corrective feedback right away. You look at maybe you look at a group of scholars that are all really struggling, so you think that planning to reteach would be the best way, or integrating it into further instruction would be the best way to close the gap. Maybe after you've reteached this and you've already integrated it a few times and they're starting to get it, your acting is, I'm going to provide this group or this scholar additional practice opportunities. So that may be a decodable text, that may be extra words that they're able to manipulate. So if they're using block letters or something like that, you're giving them extra time to do that practice. And then if you're not really understanding where the root cause is, you're going to take some time to dig deeper. So we saw on our previous slide that one thing we're doing is that we, in that acting area, that last part of that last slide, you can give corrective feedback. So when we're thinking about in the moment corrective feedback, there's a system and a way that we actually make sure that we are giving that corrective feedback. The key with corrective feedback is to maximize its use. The goal is to promote productive struggle, where the students do the most work. We don't want to give them too much help and then they're not actually learning it, but we also don't want to make them struggle too much where their frustration level is too high. We want to minimize destructive struggle where the student is stuck as a demotivating thing for the student, and that wastes such precious time. The goal is to think, why is the error happening? And let that drive the feedback delivered. So when you're thinking about the why, maybe it hasn't been taught yet. Is it not a current priority? You can let it slide, or you can correct and move on. It is not something you need to spend a 5-minute reteach on because, again, it hasn't been taught. Are they misapplying a skill or a strategy? Neutrally repeat what the student did and see if they self-correct. If they still don't know that skill, remind them what to do or how to do it. Refer them to maybe a sound wall, a word wall, or an anchor chart, and just state that strategy or generalization to give them that, oh, you're misapplying the like the OI sound. So you can either just have them glance back at the wall, ask them, what's that? After you record them, great. All right, go ahead and apply it again. Try reading that word, and then you can move on. And then if they're reaching that frustration level, correct and move on. And just as a reminder, before you think, what should I do? Make sure you're going back to, why did the student make the error? Because you want to, the way that you correct and jump in really has to be based off of why that error exists in the first place. If you are seeing a scholar that is misapplying a skill, and so you're trying to quickly have them self-correct, but you actually haven't taught it, that quickly self-correct won't make sense because they don't know the strategy. So again, going back to, why did the student make the error? That will really allow you to think, what corrective routine should you take with that scholar in that situation. All right, so now that we've talked so much about the importance of strong intervention and the importance of being able to give the right feedback at the right time, we're going to be able to practice a scenario. So the scenario is, this week we've been reading a decodable on the bus. We're using CKLA, this is a kindergarten classroom, and we're in Unit 8. Our focus is on double consonants and the K spelled CK, so the K sound, but the CK blend, digraph. Students are writing a response to the question, where did mom sit? While circulating, I noticed that Thomas has written, she sit in the back. Side note, something I really like is that not only are they practicing decoding the sound that they're working on, but then the expectation is to write comprehension questions that are directly from the text, so they're text-dependent questions, and scholars should then be able to apply the sound that they're working on into their writing. So you can see in multiple ways if the scholar is able to decode that sound correctly, but then also if they're able to write that sound correctly. So just a side note, this is a great practice for the scholars in terms of being able to see not only reading, but overall understanding of this rule. All right, so you have 1 minute to provide corrective feedback. What our conversation sound like? So I want you to think, what are the errors? What is causing the errors? What is a priority? How can I foster a productive struggle? All right, so go ahead and take 4 minutes to come up with to answer those questions. So what are all the errors? What is causing the errors? What's the priority? And then how can you foster a productive struggle? Then after everyone has those answers, or you as an individual have those answers, go ahead, and if you're with someone, you can talk about what that conversation might look like. So go ahead and pause and get to work. All right, so hopefully that was a pretty useful time, and you were able to think through a lot of different things, and you were able to really think through why you were really able to think about why did the student make that error. So there's lots of errors in here. You'll notice that the grammar, she sit in the back, the capitalization, the punctuation, but also back is spelled incorrectly. That's where the focus needs to be, because that's where the objective of this lesson is. That's the biggest priority, because this lesson is working on C, double consonant CK. When you're having this conversation with the scholar, the key things that you should have came up with during your work time with that 1 minute of productive corrective feedback for the scholar, some key ideas of that really should have been in your conversation is that 1, you're keeping all the work on the student. 2, when there are multiple errors, you focus on those most closely aligned with the current instruction, and that's the only thing you're saying to your scholar. Because if you're trying to give them that quick corrective feedback in 1 minute, and you need them to walk away with CK by also bringing up all the other errors, they're not going to remember the most important thing for this lesson. You still may want to address like capitalization and period with your overall answer when you're debriefing with your class. Maybe this isn't the exemplar that you show under your doc screen, but for this scholar, what they need to know right now is that back is spelled incorrectly. Then you go back to the rule that they've been working on and be able to adjust effectively. All right, so hopefully going through this example, you can see that it's pretty easy to think about a lot of things when you're giving that corrective feedback, but hopefully it's starting to become really natural for you to think about what's the error, what's causing that error, what's that priority, how will I give that feedback, and what will that look like? Am I modeling it? Am I showing them, referring back to an anchor chart, or am I just simply saying, hey, what's the rule we've been working on, and moving on to see if they can adjust from there. All right, so our final reflection for this time is how will targeted feedback impact students' outcomes? And then overall, any aha moment, just like name an aha moment from today.
If your school or district is interested in direct support related to the content of this session, or if you have any questions, please contact TNTP by emailing maya.baker@tntp.org or christopher.henderson@tntp.org. You can also visit us online at tntp.org or find us on Facebook, Twitter, or LinkedIn.